But the thing is, if I'm not doing it, nothing is going to happen. So I know I need to sit there and try to find...
We were all very tired, and we just felt that we have to do something else.
Under the stage lights in the 70s, ABBA looked untouchable, like nothing could break that kind of perfection. But offstage, things were already falling apart in silence, marriages cracking, while the hits kept playing louder. Fast forward to 2025 in London, and Benny Andersson is back at ABBA Voyage, reflecting on that era again. But that joy people remember, it was forged inside a storm of emotional exhaustion. From Benny himself circling back to it in past ITV and Digital Spy interviews, to him admitting how life and music collided in real time. What sparked those two marriages into ABBA's golden era? When love built the band. It started almost like a normal love story, the kind you wouldn't expect to end up shaping one of the biggest pop groups in history. Björn Ulvaeus and Agnetha Fältskog got married in 1971 in Sweden, right as Agnetha was already building a solo career and Björn was moving deeper into songwriting and performance. According to historical accounts referenced in Yahoo News Canada, that marriage wasn't just personal, it was already feeding into creative collaboration before ABBA even fully formed. And then you add Benny Andersson and Annie-Frid Lyngstad into the picture a few years later, marrying in 1978, right in the middle of ABBA's global rise after Eurovision. By that point, ABBA wasn't just a band anymore, it was basically a shared emotional ecosystem. Everyone was connected to everyone else in ways that were both creative and deeply personal. And that's where things start getting interesting. Because here's the thing. When ABBA wins Eurovision in 1974 with Waterloo, it doesn't just launch a band. It locks in a chemistry that already exists between people who are living inside each other's lives. That performance, according to Eurovision historical records and later music industry retrospectives, sold the group into global recognition, eventually pushing them toward hundreds of millions of records sold worldwide over time. And get this, songs like Fernando in 1976 don't feel like random pop writing when you look at who's involved. There's this emotional realism in the way the group was working together, almost like the relationships themselves were bleeding into the music. According to music history analysis referenced in Music News UK, ABBA's early catalog carried a kind of emotional intimacy that came directly from how intertwined their personal and professional lives were. But wait. This is where it starts to feel less like a fairy tale and more like something under pressure. Because while everything on stage looked polished, tours were non-stop, recording schedules were tight, and the group was moving from country to country almost like a machine. And when you're doing that while also married to your bandmates, there's no real separation between work and home anymore. It all blends into one continuous loop. According to Benny Andersson in a Digital Spy interview, even after the first cracks in the marriages started showing, they still kept working together because, in his words, we knew what we had. That line matters more than it sounds like it does, because it tells you something important about that era. They weren't separating life from music, they were fusing it completely. Now, think about that for a second. You're writing songs, touring the world, and the people you're harmonizing with are also the people you go home to argue with, or raise children with, or quietly drift away from. That kind of setup doesn't just create music, it creates emotional pressure that never really switches off. And yet, in the middle of all of this, ABBA doesn't slow down. If anything, they accelerate. The fame grows, the expectations grow, and the sound gets even more refined, almost like perfection becomes the only way to keep everything from falling apart too soon. But underneath that perfection, something subtle is already forming, a kind of fatigue that nobody on the outside can hear yet. Because every hit song, every televised performance, every global tour stop, it's all being powered by people whose personal lives are getting more entangled, not less. And when you look back now, it almost feels impossible that it lasted as long as it did in that form. There's a strange contrast here, and you can already feel it building. The public sees ABBA as clean, joyful, and almost eternal. But inside the structure, the emotional weight is already starting to shift in ways nobody is fully naming yet. And that's the part that makes this story so difficult to look away from. Because at some point, love stops being just the fuel and starts becoming the pressure point. And that's where everything begins to change. But those personal bonds, they bent fast under fame's relentless weight. By the late 1970s, cracks formed quietly in the same rooms birthing hits, per timelines in Yahoo Sports. Once the first marriage fractured under spotlights, how did ABBA's foundation shift in ways no one anticipated? When the music started bleeding. It happened mid-tour, lights still hot from another sold-out ABBA show, and somewhere between applause and exhaustion, Bjorn and Agnetha's marriage quietly ended in 1979. No dramatic public explosion at first, just a private fracture forming inside a band that's still printing hits like machines. According to Yahoo Sports' historical coverage of ABBA's breakup timeline, the divorce landed right as the group was still riding the massive success of Voulez-Vous, which made the contrast even more unsettling. Because on stage, nothing changed. Off stage, everything was already there. And that's where it started to feel strange. They're still performing together, still smiling for cameras, still flying from city to city as if nothing happened. But think about that for a second. You're sharing microphones with someone you're legally separating from, then stepping into arenas where millions of people think you're the definition of harmony. It's almost surreal when you sit with it long enough. Here's the thing, though. ABBA doesn't slow down. If anything, the pressure tightened. Touring continued, recording continued, and by 1980, they were still producing material that feels almost too emotionally sharp for what's happening behind the scenes. Albums like Super Trooper, recorded around this period, according to ABBA's official discography history, arrived in a moment where the personal cracks were no longer invisible. They're just professionally contained. And this is where The Winner Takes It All entered the story. Bjorn Ulvaeus wrote it right after the divorce from Agnetha. And according to Yahoo Sports' breakdown of ABBA's breakup era, the song is widely understood as a direct reflection of that separation. But what made it hit differently wasn't just the breakup itself, it's the tone of it. The lyrics feel like a courtroom disguised as a pop ballad, where love, custody, regret, and emotional settlement are all tangled into one performance. When Agnetha sang it, there was something almost too real about it. Like, she's not performing a song, she's replaying a conversation that actually happened in private. The Winner Takes It All stopped sounding like poetry and started sounding like finality, like someone signing off on a chapter they didn't fully agree to end. And wait, it got heavier when you remember they still had to perform it together. Imagine that, standing on stage, under bright lights, singing lines written out of your own divorce, while the person who wrote them was literally a few feet away. No escape, no pause button, just music continuing because the machine had to keep moving. Meanwhile, Benny Andersson and Annie-Fried Lyngstad were still together at this point, but even that relationship started feeling the pressure of everything shifting around them. According to broader ABBA historical accounts, the group's dynamic began changing after 1979, not because they stopped working well musically, but because the emotional balance inside the group was no longer stable. It's like one corner of the structure has cracked, and the rest is still holding, but only just. And here's where it gets interesting, because instead of collapsing, ABBA did the opposite. They channeled it. Songs became sharper, more reflective, sometimes even painfully self-aware. Super Trooper, in 1980, didn't feel like carefree pop anymore. It felt like performers acknowledging the weight of constant spotlight life, of always being watched, always expected to be perfect, even when things at home were anything but. According to Benny Andersson in a Digital Spy interview reflecting on those years, even after the divorces began, they continued working together because they understood what they had built, and they didn't want to lose it just because their personal lives were shifting. That line carried a lot of weight when you think about it, because it tells you the band wasn't just a creative partnership anymore, it was something closer to shared survival. But survival comes at a cost. Agnetha, according to multiple biographical accounts referenced in music retrospectives, struggled emotionally after the separation and even sought therapy during that period. And you could feel that emotional texture leaking into the music, not in a dramatic way, but in small tonal shifts. in the way certain songs felt quieter underneath the production. Now here's a question that sat uncomfortably in the middle of all this. When art comes directly from emotional collapse like that, do you still call it healing? Or is it just transformation under pressure? Every time ABBA recorded during this era, it felt like they were not just making songs anymore. They were processing something in real time, but doing it in front of the world. And the world had no idea. The public still saw harmony, still heard perfection, still danced to songs that were literally shaped inside personal endings that nobody was talking about openly yet. That gap between perception and reality was exactly where the tension started to build. And this was important because this first divorce didn't destroy ABBA. It actually intensified them. The music became more emotionally charged, more precise, almost like they were overcompensating for what was happening privately. But at some point, compensation stopped working. Because once one marriage broke inside a system like this, the question quietly shifted from how do we keep going to something much more unstable. How long can the second one hold before it follows the same path? The moment the machine started slowing down, they were still working, but something felt different in the room. It was 1981, and ABBA was in the middle of creating The Visitors, an album that already sounded like a goodbye even before anyone said the words out loud. Benny Andersson and Frida Lindstad, who then divorced according to Digital Spy's historical breakdown of ABBA's breakup timeline, were still showing up to the same studio, still recording, and still trying to hold the structure together. But here was the thing. The energy that once felt effortless was then something they were actively pushing through, and you could almost hear it in the music. The Visitors didn't feel like pop anymore in the traditional ABBA sense. It felt colder, more distant, almost like people standing in different rooms trying to communicate through walls. According to ABBA's documented recording history and later music analysis, this period marked a sharp emotional shift in their sound, where the brightness of the 70s started getting replaced with something more restrained and more tired. Now, here was where it got interesting, because the breakup didn't immediately stop the band. It did something stranger. It stretched them. Benny and Frida separated in 1981, but they were still tied to the same machine, still finishing the same album cycle, and still showing up because contracts, commitments, and maybe even habit were stronger than emotion at that point. And get this, Benny remarried Mona Norklit in the same year, 1981. Almost as if life was reorganizing itself around the collapse instead of pausing for it. Frida, meanwhile, was stepping out of the relationship and into a very different emotional space, one that multiple biographical accounts described as reflective and quietly turbulent after the separation. But the studio, that was where everything got complicated, because instead of being a place of creation, it started feeling like a holding room for something that was already ending. According to Digital Spy interviews reflecting on ABBA's later years, Benny later admitted that even when things were breaking apart personally, they continued working because of what we had. A phrase that sounded simple until you realized it was carrying the weight of an entire era, refusing to collapse all at once. And you could feel that refusal in the final recordings. The Visitors, especially tracks like the title song itself, felt almost observational, like the group was watching their own story from a distance instead of living inside it. The synth-heavy production and the colder tone all pointed to a band that had shifted from celebration into reflection without officially announcing the shift. But wait, there was something even more uncomfortable underneath it. Because while fans still saw ABBA as active, still existing, and still functioning, internally, they were already operating like something that had passed its peak. There was no official breakup announcement yet, no final press conference, and no dramatic ending moment, just a slow fading of collective intention. According to Benny Andersson in retrospective interviews referenced by Digital Spy, the idea of continuing as ABBA after this period simply didn't feel necessary anymore. Not because of conflict in the traditional sense, but because the emotional engine that powered the group had already run through its natural cycle, and that was a very different kind of ending. Frida later reflected in various biographical accounts that the post-divorce working environment wasn't hostile, but it wasn't the same either. It was functional and professional, almost like four people who once shared everything were now carefully managing what remained. And you had to sit with that image for a second, because it changed how you heard everything that came before it. Remember The Winner Takes It All from the previous chapter? That emotional intensity wasn't a one-off moment. It was part of a larger pattern where personal breakdowns were being processed through music in real time. Now, in 1981, with both couples already fractured, that pattern didn't just continue. It peaked and then started to exhaust itself. And here was the part that often got overlooked. ABBA never officially announced a breakup in the way most bands did. No dramatic statement, no final concert labeled as the end. According to historical music reporting and later retrospectives, their live performances simply stopped after 1982, almost like a system powering down without ceremony. Think about that for a moment. A band that defined global pop in the 70s didn't explode and didn't collapse publicly. It just slowly stopped producing together. And inside that silence, something else began for Benny. He moved toward musical theater and later collaborations, including work with Tim Rice, shifting away from the pop machine entirely. It wasn't abrupt, but it was noticeable, like someone stepping out of a room they'd been in for too long and realizing they could finally breathe differently. Meanwhile, Frida's path moved away from the ABBA structure entirely, her life no longer tied to that shared creative ecosystem in the same way it once was. Now let me ask you something that sat right in the middle of all this tension. Not as a dramatic question, but just something to think about quietly. When a band stopped because people inside it simply didn't have the emotional fuel anymore, was it really a breakup? Or was it exhaustion reaching its limit? Because according to Benny's own reflections in interviews cited by Digital Spy, it wasn't one single moment that ended ABBA. It was a gradual realization that continuing in the same form no longer made sense, even if nothing catastrophic forced it. And that distinction mattered more than it first appeared. By the time the final sessions of The Visitors wrapped, the sound of ABBA had already changed permanently. The energy that once felt like joy wrapped in melody now felt like a memory trying to hold itself together one last time before dissolving. But the story didn't fully close here, because decades later, something unexpected would bring them back into the same orbit again, not as a band trying to survive fame, but as something else entirely, something that forced all of these old fractures to be looked at again under a very different light. When the past walked back on stage, ABBA Arena in London was glowing again, but this time, it didn't feel like the 70s anymore. It felt like a memory rebuilt with technology. And in May 2025, something happened that fans never expected to see again in real life. Benny Andersson and Annie Fried Lyngstad appeared together at the ABBA Voyage 3rd anniversary event. According to ITV news coverage of the May 27, 2025 celebration, it was the first public appearance of key ABBA members together in decades, and the crowd's reaction said everything before anyone even spoke.
The music, the costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
And get this, it wasn't a comeback announcement, not a new album reveal, and not even a performance. It was just presence. 4 people, then older, were standing in the same orbit again, while digital avatars of their younger selves performed on stage behind them. Now, here was where it got interesting, because the internet did what the internet always did. Within hours, headlines started shifting the moment into something bigger than it actually was. Some tabloids began suggesting emotional confessions, especially around Benny and Frida, framing it like unresolved romance was suddenly resurfacing under the lights. But when you actually checked verified reporting from outlets like RTE News and West End Theatre's official coverage of the anniversary, there was no confirmed confession, no romantic revival, and no hidden announcement. Just a reunion tied to the celebration of ABBA Voyage's continued success. And that contrast mattered, because while speculation built outside, inside the arena, the reality was much quieter. According to West End Theatre's 2025 report on the event, the anniversary included expanded show dates and continued strong audience demand, reinforcing that ABBA Voyage was still operating as a live entertainment project built around digital avatars, not a reunion of the original band in active creative form. But wait, let's slow down for a second, because this was where perception and reality started drifting apart again, just like they did in the 70s. You'd gotten headlines talking about unfaded love, fans interpreting old chemistry through modern optics, and then you'd gotten the facts sitting underneath it, which were much simpler and honestly less dramatic. According to ITV News and RTE's coverage, the appearance of Benny and Frida at the ABBA Arena on May 27, 2025, was part of a scheduled anniversary celebration, not a personal or romantic statement. Still, you could understand why people read more into it, because when you looked at their history, all the divorces, the shared studio years, the emotional weight of songs like The Winner Takes It All, it became almost impossible for the public not to project a narrative back onto them. It was like the past never fully left the room. It just changed form. And get this, Benny was then 78 during these appearances, Frida also well into her later years. And yet the fascination around them hadn't really aged with them. It was still frozen in that ABBA-era image, where everything looked like harmony, even when it wasn't. According to historical ABBA documentation and multiple entertainment retrospectives, ABBA Voyage itself launched in 2021 as a virtual concert experience, using digital avatars of the band performing as they appeared in their prime.
This is actual performance from the ABBA pop stars themselves, but using de-aged digital twins presented on the stage as avatars.
That concept alone already blurred time, because you were watching the past perform in the present, while the real people stood nearby as observers of their own history. And honestly, that's where it started to feel almost surreal, because you weren't just watching a reunion, you were watching layers of time stacked on top of each other. The younger versions of ABBA were on stage singing, while the older versions were sitting in the same space, watching what they once were, now permanently preserved in performance form. But here was the uncomfortable truth that got lost in all the noise. Nothing about this event signaled a romantic restart or hidden emotional confession. According to verified reporting from RTE Entertainment's May 2025 coverage, there was no announcement of new music, no official reunion project beyond ABBA Voyage, and no indication that the group was re-entering studio collaboration. So what was actually happening here? It was respect. It was distance softened by time. People who once shared intense creative and personal history chose to exist in the same space again without reopening the past. And that wasn't as dramatic as tabloids wanted it to be, but it was more human in a way. Because if you stripped away the headlines, what you were left with was something quieter. Two former couples who built one of the biggest pop legacies in history, standing in the same room decades later, not as lovers, not as a band returning, but as people who survived the weight of what they created together. And maybe that's why the audience reaction felt so emotionally loaded anyway. Not because something new was happening, but because something old was still visible. Now let me ask you something that sat right under all of this. Not for drama, just for reflection. When a story was this tied to the past, did we actually see what was in front of us? Or did we only see what we remembered? Because what happened in London in 2025 wasn't ABBA coming back. It was ABBA being looked at through layers of memory, technology, and expectation all at once. And that tension between reality and perception was exactly where the next question began to form. What exactly did Benny Andersson finally confirm at 78 that changed how all of this was understood? The truth beneath the glitter. He didn't say it like a headline, not like a scandal, and not like a confession meant for shock value. It came out more like someone finally naming something they'd carried for decades. Benny Andersson, looking back on the ABBA years in reflections documented through later interviews and reported summaries, such as those referenced in lock music analysis pieces, circled back to one idea that cut through everything else. It wasn't one person that broke them. It was exhaustion. Real, accumulated, relational exhaustion. And once you heard that, the entire story tilted. Because all this time, people were looking for a single her, a single emotional trigger, or a single clean explanation that could wrap ABBA's ending into something simple. But what Benny kept pointing to, again and again in retrospective commentary, was something messier. According to interviews cited in music retrospectives and entertainment reporting like M-News All Play news coverage, the collapse wasn't dramatic in the way people imagined. It was slow. It was energy thinning out across years of touring, recording, divorcing, and continuing anyway. And get this, that word, continuing, was doing a lot of work there. Because ABBA didn't stop when things got hard. They kept going through Bjorn and Agnetha's divorce in 1979. They kept going through Benny and Frida's separation in 1981. And they kept going even while the emotional structure underneath the band was changing shape in real time. It was almost like the machine didn't break. It just started running without the same fuel. Now, here was where it got interesting. Benny's later reflections didn't frame it as bitterness. There was no blame and no dramatic rewriting of history. Instead, what came through was something quieter and honestly more unsettling. A sense that they simply reached a point where the overlap between personal life and professional life stopped being sustainable. You could feel that idea buried in how he described the latter period. According to reporting that compiled his post-ABBA reflections, including summaries from Lock Music's coverage of his statements, he talked about energy running out, not just individually, but collectively. Like the system itself had been stretched across too many emotional directions at once. And think about that for a second. You'd gotten 4 people tied together creatively, 2 marriages inside that structure, both breaking apart while the work still demanded harmony. Not metaphorical harmony, but literal vocal harmony. You still had to sound like everything fitted, even when nothing in your personal life did anymore. But wait, it got heavier when you connected it back to the music. Because songs like The Winner Takes It All, and later The Visitors, didn't just feel like isolated emotional moments anymore. They started looking like symptoms of a longer process. According to ABBA's documented discography timeline and critical music analysis, those albums emerged in the exact period where personal relationships inside the group were dissolving. But the creative output was still expected to remain at a peak level. So the music didn't lie. It just didn't explain itself directly. And that's where Benny's truth landed with more weight than people expected. It wasn't a hidden romance, not a secret betrayal, and not one person was responsible for the end. It was just the accumulation of emotional strain across years of overlapping lives, where even the happiest-sounding records were being built in rooms where people were quietly running out of emotional capacity. Now let me ask you something, and it sat right in the middle of all this without needing a dramatic answer. When people created something that lasted longer than the relationships that built it, what exactly were we actually listening to later on? The joy of the moment, or the residue of everything that broke along the way? According to Benny's own reflections, as summarized in modern reporting, the reason ABBA couldn't continue wasn't a lack of success. It was that continuing in the same structure no longer made sense emotionally. They had already given what they had to give inside that configuration, and that was the part that rewrote everything. It wasn't a collapse in the traditional sense, it was completion, followed by silence. And when you stepped back, the awful truth everyone kept trying to find a name for wasn't hidden in one person, or one event, or one moment of rupture. It was sitting in plain sight the whole time. The music was being powered by real relationships, and when those relationships reached their limits, the system naturally followed. But even that wasn't where the story fully ended. Because decades later, something happened that brought all of them back into the same orbit again. Not as what they were, not as what people imagined they might become again, but as something entirely different, shaped by time itself. And the way that reunion unfolded said something even deeper about what ABBA actually became after the silence. So that's the full picture. Not one hidden her, not a single scandal, but exhaustion built over years of love, divorce, and music colliding until even ABBA couldn't keep stretching it. And when Benny reflects on it in later interviews referenced across music retrospectives, the truth lands softer but heavier, like a machine that simply ran out of energy. Then, 2025's ABBA Voyage moment in London reminds everyone, even after everything, the legacy still stands. And that's the twist. It never ended. It just evolved. Which revelation changed how you see ABBA? Could they ever truly tour live again?